Well, hello, and I hope that you are settled comfortably with your cup of coffee or whatever it is that you like to imbibe while we have our Thursday noontime webinar. We've got a very special one today. It looks like once again we're going to have a record attendee. We certainly had more people signing up, registering for the webinar than ever before. So thank you for the support as always to Biznews. Before we get into introducing our guests and our panelists, you'll see that I'm Stuart Lohman today. I'm not actually Stuart Lohman, I'm Alec Hogg, but my colleague Stuart Lohman is indeed with us, our managing editor. Stu, do you want to just take us through the technicals so everybody, we'll make sure everyone's hearing us and then knows how to participate?
Excellent, thanks, Alec, good to be here. Yeah, so if you can see two not so pretty faces and hear my voice, there should be a little high five button on your control panel on the right-hand side. Oh, I see there's only one face now.
Well, you did say cool. Pretty faces, not so pretty faces, so, well.
No, we'll see. Okay, cool, Alec, I've got some high fives coming through, so the audio must be going through nice in the visuals. As those who are new to the webinar, we do like to keep them conversational. Just on that same control panel, there's a questions drop-down menu there. If you put your questions in there, we can sort of push him on to the panelists who I'm sure Alec will introduce in a few minutes. But Alec, I think that's it from my side.
Brilliant. Well, the process today is going to be, and hopefully the sound, I've just boosted the sound a little bit on the mixer, so maybe that's better. If you do have a problem with sound or anything else, please just ping those questions. The process today is that we're going to introduce our three guests. As you can see on your screen right now, it's Ray Cadies, Peter Castleden, and Nick Hudson. I'm going to ask each of them in their introduction just for about 5 minutes to give us some insight into why it is that they feel the way that they do about the lockdown. It's all about the lockdown today and the impact of the lockdown on the South African economy. It's an incredibly difficult balance that one has to reach during this COVID-19 pandemic time. However, there are some very, very clear signals to the direction that needs to be taken, and perhaps in certain instances, the direction that hasn't been taken that well. But I'm going to ask you please to participate in the conversation by sending your questions in. As Stuart said, there's a little drop-down box there. Just type your questions in, and after we've had our brief introductions of our panelists, we'll go straight to your questions. I'd like to just remind you that we always have many, many more questions than we are able to answer. What I will do today is just encourage you to get your questions in as early as possible. But let's kick off with Ray Cadies. Ray, we can now, perhaps, there we go. We should be able to get you onto the screen. Ray, do you want to just open up your, there we go. Okie doke. And I'll give you a little bit more information about this pretty face. I've been reading your stuff on, as I reading your stuff, I've been following your progress on Facebook, and you've built an army of followers. There's everything that one needs to know about Ray Cadies on the screen right now, ex-Zimbabwean. Why have you taken such an intense interest in COVID-19?
Alec, I've just been, I was originally shocked by, obviously, by all the footage and stuff that we saw on media, but I then started thinking about the stuff, and I've just been more and more astounded. I actually can't believe I'm here talking about some things, because the first Facebook post I made was in the beginning of April, and I actually hurried to type it because I thought if I didn't post it quickly, then my point would be extinct already. So I thought people were going to see this picture so quickly, and here I am, like almost 2 months later. I'm still holding the same view and still frustrated. So that's why I'm here.
What's the picture that you're seeing?
You know, I do like that phrase that everyone behaves according to the pictures they see. There's actually only one reality in life, but everyone sees a different picture of it, and it determines how people behave. So, you know, with the CV-19 pandemic, when it started, there was only one picture that everybody saw. And it was a combination of footage from the BBC or CNN on news, and all you saw were ICUs and people dying and ventilators and queues outside hospitals and doctors burning out. And on the other side, you just got a string of bad data thrown at you about how calamitous this would be in terms of the population of the earth. So those two things created a picture, and for me, it's just unquestionable. The picture underpinned behavior, and the behavior that underpinned was panic. And I'm certain that everybody panicked because of the bad data and the mass hysteria fueled by the media. I draw the analogy to flying an airplane. You know, if basically what I think is this planet was flown and still is being flown largely on one instrument, which is the medical one. And I always say, if you were on a plane and you walked past the cockpit and looked in through the door, and you saw the pilots had covered all the instruments except for one, you'd get off that plane, because the plane can't be flown on one instrument. You're going to crash. And here we are on planet Earth, and the only instrument we're looking at is a medical one. And I would contest that the medical instrument is probably of the magnitude of a seatbelt light on an airplane. So we're flying, I think, on blindly on one instrument. So I think it's very dangerous. I also find that entering the debate about lockdown and saving lives is itself not relevant, really. I know we're going to end up going there. That's where we're going to spend most of the time, I think. But lockdown was never intended to save lives. So to compare how many lives will be saved versus how many lives are going to be cost is actually not a relevant debate. It wasn't intended for that. It was justified actually after the panic to flatten the curve. That was the point of it, and to build medical capacity, which some countries can and some can't. But it was never intended to cure and escape a virus. It cannot cure and escape a virus. So there's no evidence at all that lockdown can or will save lives, because there are additional lives that will be cost as a result from like surgeries that haven't happened, from cancer treatments, diagnosis that hasn't happened, from stress, even suicide. So I think there's no evidence that lockdown can or will reduce loss of life. And there's no evidence that a broad, shallow curve, flattened curve, is better or worse than a steep, narrow one. So the curve itself, I think, is questionable. I draw the analogy of the wildebeest crossing the plains of Central Africa. When the food runs out, they have to cross the one river that crosses the Mara River, and it's full of crocodiles. But they have no choice, because they have to find a sustainable food source. They get to the bank of the river and they look in there, they see the crocodiles, and nobody likes that, but they know they have to go. So they jump in, and quite a few of them die. You know, if somebody really thought that they were a wildebeest lover and decided they wanted to end all death by crocodiles, then they may consider putting a fence up to save those crocodiles, save the deaths from the crocodiles. And they would save those deaths from the crocodiles, but every wildebeest would starve. So that's what I think is happening here. What started as a small-scale medical crisis has turned into a gigantic humanitarian crisis. We're trying to save a few crocodiles, and we're killing a vast number. Wildebeest.
I like it. I like the analogy that you use. Nick Hudson, if you could switch on your camera now, and Peter Castleden, both of you are from PANDA. I think we can probably introduce the two of you together, as you are comrades in arms. Peter, I see you've come up first. I'm sure Nick will join us in just a second. What is PANDA exactly?
PANDA is essentially a quasi-organized group of like-minded individuals who found each other through various mechanisms. So there's about a dozen of us involved now, and out of everyone there, I probably only knew one of them from before getting on. So I think there were a few of us who were raising some questions early on in the process, but simply looking at the data and applying our minds and some common sense. And Nick and I actually found each other on Twitter and started talking, and Nick is far more organized than I am, so got a coalition of the willing together to start almost independently analyzing the situation. So personally, how I got involved in this question was that fairly early on. Okay, so my technical background is in life insurance for a very long time. So you can develop some kind of intuition around mortality and deaths and predictions just from having experience with this stuff. So early on, I had a fair confidence that this virus wasn't going to be as bad as the epidemiological models were anticipating. And certainly not as bad as the World Health Organization was saying with their 3-point-odd% fatality rate. And that was basically off the assumption that the virus can be one of two things. It can be incredibly contagious or incredibly deadly. If it was both, we would have seen it in the areas that had taken hold. So the hypothesis was this thing is a lot more contagious than we're anticipating, but not that deadly. But the thing that got me really interested was that there's not a lot of skin in the game with these epidemiological models. So when my favorite person, Neil Ferguson, who happens to predict 12 out of every one pandemic, was predicting these giant models, there's not really a lot of repercussions for being on the high side of those predictions, except for in this case where the world has gone somewhat, let's call it an overreaction. Whereas in the life insurance game, you actually, it's very important that you get your mortality assumptions correct. If you're too low, you will lose money or potentially risk insolvency. If you're too high, you won't sell anything because your competition will get it right. So accuracy with mortality modeling is a competitive advantage and something we get quite good at. So I realized that there's a trade-off happening here with lockdown or not lockdown. There are, I mean, Ray's covered some, there are some definite costs of lockdown. And in the South African context, although it's true globally, socioeconomic class is next to age, the biggest leading indicator of mortality. So where you have an economy that's getting crushed, the narrative being that it's about money is kind of lazy thinking. It's actually about people's lives, and by and large, this lockdown is going to have the greatest impact on the poor. And so I started modeling. Okay, so let's see what happens if we do have small impairments on the mortality of the underlying population because of an extra few million people going below the breadline. What does that look like in terms of what are the costs we're paying for lives on the other side of the equation? And the results are staggering. It's a no-brainer that this is costing the country more in terms of the metric we used, which is years of life lost. This is not casting judgment that lockdown was a bad idea, but we thought it was useful to at least have the trade-off on the table. So we are making informed decisions and allocating resources correctly, because this is a resource allocation game at the end of the day. Is that South Africa has limited resources. What can we do the most with to limit the ultimately the damage? So that's kind of where I got started, and then I was introduced to a team of very talented, enthusiastic people via Nick, and then we just carried on since then. So yeah, that's it.
Nick, let's try and bring you in if you can. See if you're.
Well, let's see if you got my voice.
We got your voice. We just haven't got your webcam.
Well, you're not missing much on the picture, so maybe you can do without. And that's me when I was far younger. I'll settle for that image.
Good. Well, let's just go through a little bit of the background from your side. I guess what I'd like to ask you guys is, with your analysis, Warren Buffett's close pal, and Ray and I were at the Berkshire Hathaway AGM a few years ago, Charlie Munger, says that when you want to get to the truth, first try and disprove what it is that you think. In other words, invert. When you started putting these numbers together, did you do that? Did you invert before trying to prove what is now quite a staggering set of data?
I'll try and answer that. So what I tried to do in the modeling was to prove the counter hypothesis.
Can Nick, did you do that or not? I'm trying to introduce Nick.
No, it's okay. Sorry.
Peter's the man to answer this one.
You got it.
Okay, so I'll be very quick. So what we tried to, I mean, essentially this is fairly straightforward when you're doing. So maybe one point: models are always wrong. Actuarial models are wrong. Epidemiological models are also wrong. So they're informative, and the simpler you can keep a model, the more confidence you can have in it. So that was the one thing, is we tried to keep the model pretty simple. The second thing is we tried to prove the trade-off was as small as possible, and ideally that lockdown made sense. And we did that by assuming incredibly high death toll on the COVID side, and fairly conservative mortality adjustments on the economic side. So and then we were getting still multiples of the costs coming through. So that's a roundabout way of saying, yes, we weren't trying to tell a story. We were trying to get conservative answer that then told probably a scarier story.
Thanks, Peter. All right, Nick, from your side, what got you involved in PANDA?
Well, I had a very strange introduction to the epidemic. I was watching it closely because I run a small private equity business, and we were keeping an eye on this because we have one portfolio company that is got some customers of customers who are in China, and there was this epidemic taking hold. And so we felt that we needed to just look at this, keep an eye on it, and I was following it. Being an actuary by background, it's sort of close to home as well in terms of wanting to understand the evolution of illness and so on. That's just interesting for a person who once was. I was very interested in the whole Diamond Princess story. There was that ship in the beginning of February and the horror story of these people who are trapped on board with this virus, doing the rounds, doing rampaging around the ship, and people dying, and the Japanese authorities not even allowing the ship to dock. They didn't want it to touch the pier. That's how afraid they were of this setup. And I mean, putting the drama aside, which is very high drama, you look at the situation as an actuary or an epidemiologist or somebody interested in the numbers, and you say, this is amazing. This is going to save us months and months, possibly years, in trying to reach an understanding of the virus. Because what it presents you with is a little closed population of people of varying ages and genders and nationalities and so on, and 3,700 of them on board the ship. And this virus is going to sweep through. And you're going to get like you can call it a snapshot of how this illness is going to behave. And you had to wait. Somebody was going to do a study and describe it all and put it into an academic paper and make it available for the world to see. And that day happened on the 8th of March. I'll never forget it. 9th of March, I'd finished this little spreadsheet. And I decided to myself, based on looking at that spreadsheet, that this disease was not going to be a very big thing. And that's probably the worst intellectual error I've ever committed in my life. But in my defense, I believe at this stage, looking at this disease, that reaction was correct with respect to the disease. It was 100% incorrect with respect to the reaction, the panic that has followed and swept around the world faster than the virus. And for me, I then, as the events began to unfold in the rest of the world, as the media storm around this thing unfolded, as lockdowns began to be imposed, as civil liberties were taken away everywhere, even in countries that seemingly were not under major threat, I became more and more concerned. And then I began to realize, along with I think a lot of other people in the world, that there was a trap in this whole lockdown setup. Brave be the politician who's prepared to lift the lockdown in the event that there are many deaths resurging because of the result of the lifted lockdown. That is political suicide. So how do you get out of these things? And I kind of put all of that together, started speaking to my friends who were maybe interested, found that there were very few who agreed with me. And then, as Peter described earlier, just gradually started finding like-minded individuals who were seeing the world the same way. That this was not going to be the hundreds of millions of cases that people were speaking about hundreds of millions of deaths that people were speaking about at the time. We built a little model based on that ship, and that model suggested to us that there might be as much as 40,000 deaths in the UK, in extreme cases, a bit more. And we kind of looked at this, and as we were looking at it, out came Neil Ferguson with 500,000 deaths in the UK. And that was just, at that point, we realized, no way, somebody's missed this boat. So that's the introduction, Alec.
Brilliant. That's Neil Ferguson report, and I guess we'll just put on the webcams now, because we're going to be answering questions in just a moment. There's a pile of them that have come through, as we always know. Raymond, you can join us as well if you want to switch on your webcam. I see Nick's got a problem with his. But that Neil Ferguson report you're referring to is the Imperial College, which changed the whole direction of the way the UK was handling it, because the report said that 550,000 people could die in the UK, 2.2 million if the virus was left unchecked. So that's just by way of background. Let's get into the first of the questions. Peter Loebscher wants to know your views on the projection around local COVID-19 epidemic, when it will peak, around August or September. We know from earlier this week that government is now looking at 45,000 deaths as a maximum. Well, certainly that's the projection, and that could be as late as November. Thoughts, please. Peter?
Okay, so I don't like making predictions because they come back to haunt you. But there's certain things we have to believe for those numbers to be plausible. Okay, so and this is just a question of can we believe these things? Firstly, it's quite interesting to look at the case counts they're projecting, and I'd really these are professionals doing the models. This is no judgment. This is just observation off the back of them. But currently, the world has recorded a shade over 5 million cases, of which the majority will be symptomatic, and we don't know how much further the tail will be, but we've probably gone past half, but it almost doesn't really matter. We're sitting at about 5 million now. The model in South Africa is projecting that South Africa alone, at a single point in time, will have over 1 million active cases. That's not cumulative cases, that's active cases. So we have to believe that a population the size of 0.67% of the global population will contribute a full quarter of the active cases the world has seen cumulatively to date. Okay, you can make up your mind whether that's plausible or not. There's also seems to be we know by now which are the susceptible groups. Europe has gone through, most of it has gone through their inflection points. The fatality is really bad above age 85, 75, it kind of declines. So it's older ages and comorbidities. The worst country to date, if you're measuring deaths per mil, is currently the champs of Belgium, sitting at about 750 deaths per mil, but with a median population age of about 42, 43 years. Okay, and the other big culprits of killers here, the Italies, the Spains, the UKs, are all sitting in that mid-40 range of age. So it's not necessarily predictive, but it's quite interesting. South Africa, on the other hand, is sitting at about a 27.5 median age. So we have a very young population group. Yet, if we get to 45,000 deaths, we will essentially match Belgium. So we have to believe we are going to be as bad as the current worst in the world. And Belgium are still going to be racking up deaths, so they're not done. But it's slowing down. So we have to believe that. And then you can say, well, what could be the contributing factors that could explain that? Because we have some unique situations. The two big question marks would be TB and HIV. And we are clearly uniquely positioned with both. But with HIV, for example, we are not the only country on earth with HIV. So New York City has a proportion of people with HIV, not nearly our levels, clearly. But looking at their death data, HIV didn't seem to emerge as a particularly significant comorbidity factor. Okay, well, that's good news. That's not bad news. But it's not clear. It's obviously not definitive that we won't have the problem because New York didn't, or other places where there was HIV. And the medical guys on our teams are saying that if HIV and TB were going to be a big problem here, they will be a problem. If they were going to be a big problem here, we would have started to see it already. So every day that goes past that we don't see those two causes as being significant comorbidity factors is great news for the fact that it may not be that bad. Out of interest, it looks like Europe's pattern of deaths follows influenza. I'm not talking about quantity, I'm just talking about who is getting knocked by influenza. It's pretty similar to COVID. In South Africa, our prevalence of HIV is about 13-14%, and our flu deaths HIV population is about 30%. So that would suggest that if you're just being rough, that HIV might double your susceptibility to COVID, which is a reason why we might have more deaths than someone with a country without HIV. But in my opinion, unlikely that it gets us to Belgian levels. And then the last one is the peak. So in the Western Cape, we're on this wave. I don't think lockdown is going to make any further difference if you look at how the cases are growing. And in almost every country on earth, the wave didn't last and wouldn't have lasted until a peak in August, September. Nationally, perhaps we can get there because different waves are starting at different places. But in the Western Cape, it's unlikely we're peaking that late, given where we are now. So I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just it would be really disappointing if we did get to those levels in South Africa.
Yeah, I think
I've been while you were talking, things on the some fascinating information that you can get from Johns Hopkins University, which I'm sure you guys have been watching a whole lot of. But let's pick up with you, Raymond. You've been quiet for a while. What is your view on where we might end up in this country and when we'll peak?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to be on this panel with these two guys with some pedigree and with all these fancy charts and stuff, because I've got none of them. And for me, I actually find the question, obviously it's a quest for information that people want, everyone wants to know as much as possible. But for me, it's like the wildebeest on the bank of the river, asking the baby wildebeest, ask the mommy wildebeest, Mom, do you think, how many of us think we'll be eaten this year by these crocodiles? And she'll answer and might be right or wrong. And then they ask the mom, do you think they'll eat us in the first half of the river? Or do you think more of us get eaten in the middle or in the second half of the river? And the mom must just tell them to jump in the river and they just got to go, because I've got no idea how to predict this. Well, I haven't tried. And I'm happy that Peter and Nick can add value there and have done. But for me, I think it's just an element of fear. The questions that these are arising like this, it's all out of fear, which is understandable. But we don't know how many crocodiles there are, because we didn't cross this river last year, and the crocodiles are a different kind, and we don't know if maybe the river's a bit higher or lower. So maybe in the first half of the river or the middle, the second half, the wildebeest must just jump in here, and we got to go.
Nick, I've got on the screen the total cases for South Africa. We had that peak a few days ago at 1160 on the 17th of May, but there's a very clear trend that South Africa's on now. Although the last 2 days the numbers have been below trend, are you expecting that this is going to continue exponentially? Because I think most South Africans are just wanting to know, when are we going to get to a place where we will be able to get back to some semblance of normality?
Yeah, Alec, there's a limit to what you can infer from the case numbers. You know, there are all sorts of things going on there. You've got a population of people who are already infected, many of whom would be asymptomatic. You've got a testing regime that varies up and down every day in terms of how many tests they are able to perform, how many are contact and trace tests, how many are people presenting at hospitals, and so on. So there's an awful lot going on with those numbers. And so we tend not to spend too much time worrying about the case story. We think it's very misleading and it's going to cause all sorts of incorrect decision making. I mean, it's not impossible that we have as many as 500,000 or more people out there at the moment who are infected. You know, the cases are going to always be a tiny fraction of the infections. So if you look at the deaths, can you see a peak there? No, I wouldn't say that we can call that a peak yet. But what can we say about what has happened in other countries? Of the 66 countries that have peaked by our analysis elsewhere in the world, 56 of them peaked in the range of 50 to 80 days after the first death. And if I'm not mistaken, we're sitting at about 53 days after our first death. So we're into that window where the majority of countries have peaked. And, you know, based on that kind of analysis, you'd say sometime next month, you know. I have found it very odd that the SEIR modelers, the guys who are putting these fancy charts together, are predicting long dates. You know, some of them July, some September, some even November. And I'm sort of looking at that and saying to myself, how can it be? You know, this is, I get it that you've got a model and so on, and its parameters have been carefully and scientifically chosen against the best available data, et cetera, et cetera. But if that model is being breached by evidence all around the world on an almost daily basis, don't you begin to worry about whether the whole model structure is sound? Forget the parameters, you know. So for our sense is that we have no reason to believe that South Africa will behave any differently from the rest of the world, that the peak will come quite quickly, and that you'll have a drop-off after that peak. And I think, another interesting thing, people say, oh, but we've had the very strong lockdown, this draconian lockdown. Surely that slowed us all down. Well, not so fast, because we've looked at those 66 countries and their peaks, and we've compared that to the stringency of their lockdowns. There are two ways of doing that. The one way you can do it is by looking at the Oxford time series of lockdown stringency. It's a little score that they track for all countries in the world. And the other way is by looking at mobility data, cell phone tower data. You can measure how much people are moving around. And whether we use the stringency measure or the actual movement measures as a measure of lockdown intensity, we're not seeing that there's any difference in the duration to the peak of an epidemic in any country based on how strong its lockdown has been. It seems to make no difference whatsoever.
On the screen now, we've got, and I was looking for this in various parts from Johns Hopkins University, which I think it speaks to your point, Peter. There you can see the United States. These are the confirmed new cases, which have reduced significantly from their peak in April. United Kingdom, the same way around. Italy, France. France is actually a particularly good graph if you look at the moving averages there, peaking at daily 5,900, and it's down to, well, 451, I think, was the 665 was the latest one. Spain, Belgium, not so good, but still Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Ireland. There we have it. South Africa, of course, is at a very different phase in that process. But let's just get to the questions now. Gerard Cook wants to know about the insurance industry, and maybe Ray, you can pick up on this, being in the financial services sector. He says that the insurance industry is not coming to the party. Few major car accidents, lower household burglaries, name only a few. Why aren't they cutting their premiums?
Alec, I'm not sure. That seems to sound like the insurance industry is making a lot of money out of this. I haven't analyzed that either, but I would imagine not. I've heard about, for example, the pandemic insurance is like a sort of obscure little clause that has hardly ever been invoked, I think. I mean, Peter and Nick know more about this than I do, but I mean, you take, for example, cancellation of the Japan Olympics. I mean, that must have been quite expensive for some insurance company. And there are a lot of things that I imagine insurance companies are hurting on big time. And some people some hotels have got cover for occupancy that is lost due to pandemics. I think a lot of different clauses. So, I mean, whereas there definitely would be less house breakings because there's no one walking around, and materially less car accidents. I think you've got to look at all the countries are different, and all the different sectors and all the different types of insurance for different events are all different. So I think it's a very complicated picture there.
Interesting point.
I'll just maybe add to that. On the personal line stuff that you'll get from your short-term insurers, I mean, my broker rebated me about 20% of my premium because of precisely the reason that my risk of car accidents is lower. So there are some doing it, but on the life side, I mean, I can't speak for the entire industry, but we're not particularly worried about claims. The worry is actually the economic impact in terms of people's ability to actually maintain the cover that they need. And I think that would probably also be true on the short-term side. So millions of people losing work and going below the breadline is going to have a negative impact on the insurance industry's ability to maintain the in-force books. Which is not good, in spite of what claim would be happening on the claim side.
Your 25% rebate is something that Discovery, I was talking to Anton Ossip yesterday from Discovery Insure. They've just done that automatically across the board, given back 25%.
Yeah, there's definitely more than one doing that.
Gerardus de Klerk says, please comment on the trade-off between life and the economy. Both will kill.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to start with that. So this is a trade-off that is not unique to a COVID situation. So the way there's various measures you can use to do this, but we use the concept of years of life lost, which is fairly standard in these kind of things. So essentially, you can work out every individual has, say, lives in the bank. Okay, so I mean, I must preface this by saying that obviously every single death is tragic in its own way, but the death of a baby is on the life lost metric is more tragic than the death of a 105-year-old, to put it that way. So the trade-off is there's definitely going to be lives lost either way. What we were trying to do is to quantify the relative impact on both sides. One of the critiques we did get was we're assuming it's a misunderstanding, but we're assuming the economy would have chugged along 100% merrily with COVID, and we're now attributing all the pain to the lockdown. But that's a misunderstanding. We actually have specifically stripped out the economic impact of lockdown and are still assuming there would have been a 5, 6, 7% GDP contraction because of COVID on its own. The additional piece we actually have quantified is arguably self-inflicted.
The question that comes from Jaco van der Merwe is there are more and more international voices of virologists going up that corona is overestimated, especially for younger people. And his question is, when will the powers start to listen to them? You guys are making a strong point. Are you getting much traction amongst those who do make the decisions on the issues that you are highlighting? Nick?
Well, it's maybe not entirely to do with the decision makers, because they're political animals themselves and they respond to political pressures. So the question is, what does the man in the street think of this disease? And we've had some very interesting work done in that regard. We have a collaboration with an NGO that's got incredible access in South Africa's townships, and they conducted a little survey. 78% of the respondents, and it was quite a big survey, believed that every person was at equal risk of death to coronavirus. Now, the reality is that some fraction of 1% of a population like South Africa's is at risk of death to coronavirus. This disease overwhelmingly strikes people who are old and sick at the same time. There's a big question yet to be answered by, it's almost philosophical. Are we talking about death with coronavirus or death from coronavirus in a lot of these cases? So there's a complete misread of what the risk is for most of the population. So I'd say anybody up to the age of about 50, anybody up to the age of 65 who's in healthy condition, this disease is something probably less than or equal to the normal flu that does the rounds. Above that age, the odds start looking worse. It looks a bit worse than the flu. And when you get to the point of being an 85-year-old with a couple of serious comorbidities, then it can be a calamitous business. But that also needs to be seen in context. I mean, not a bad way of thinking about this virus is because it has such a high spread rate. What it's doing is kind of sweeping through the world's population and picking out the people who are, in a bad way. And that's all reflected in Peter's modeling. It's kind of, we look at how serious, what serious comorbidities people have and how likely they would have been to die. Now, I hate these numbers. The trade-off for me is just, my stomach turns when you have to talk in this way. I really don't enjoy it at all. But it kind of, at some level, it's unavoidable. You have to make choices as a policymaker, and they're incredibly hard to make. But they'd be a lot easier to make if the man in the street had an accurate perception of the disease. And it's been part of this media circus that and this unbelievable social media panic and fear that is driven into people's minds the concept of an ogre, where actually we're dealing with a much less threatening beast.
Talking about beast, Adele Gordon says, Wildebeest, really? Can we get to the facts?
Just some perspective in the facts. I mean, basically, to date, we've lost about 330,000 people have died with CV19. Now, whether they died from it or not, we know all that whole debate. Maybe a quarter of them died from it, maybe less, but 330 is the number. And on Earth, 60 million people die every year on Earth. And there are 140 million people born every year on Earth. So the current deaths are 0.5%, 0.5% of the annual deaths on this Earth. 0.5% of the deaths, and they are 0.24% of the annual births, number of people to date. Now, if you multiply that by 10, it's still a tiny number of the annual births and deaths. And then you get to a situation where, you know, they reckon 2.6 billion people are out of work, either partially or completely. Now, you don't even need a model for that. You can see what's going to happen with that. And there are 40 million new jobless people in America, new people without jobs, and they've lost 90,000 lives. You know, so I would say that, you know, that people talk about epicenters for this thing, and you would say, where's the epicenter of the CV19 issue? And people would probably choose Italy or New York City. And I would say somewhere like Las Vegas would be my choice. If you take Las Vegas as a city, an entire city, all of its jobs built on hotels and tourism are gone. All the people's careers, all their food, all the children, the education. You take the cruise industry, or you take the poorest people in Africa, you take the Uber drivers who's sending their money back home to families that have got 5 to 10 dependents each. They've got no cash. So I think, you know, South Africa, we've lost 300 people so far, and we are growing. But there's 60 million of us here. So we've lost 5 people per million. For every million people in the population, we've lost 5 so far. And we might be losing 5 million jobs. We have lost millions of jobs. We might lose 3 to 5, 7 million jobs. And what's going to happen to the people? Where do they get money from? Where do they buy food? How do they buy food? So the perspective is important, Alec.
Rhett Baines wants to know from you, is there a hidden agenda in all of this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I know Rhett, but I don't have an agenda, obviously. I've no axe to grind at all.
Is there a hidden agenda behind the continued lockdown?
I've read all those conspiracy things, and I'm just not a fan of that, Alec. You know, I don't know. You know, I'm not a fan of there being a South African agenda in terms of pursuit of communism, or you know, a Chinese agenda in terms of this is their version of warfare, or you know, I'm really not a fan of all that. I think it's all happened a bit too fast for anyone to have thought this out. There's too much panic going on for someone to have come in with some evil intent on top of it all.
I was very interested in what Professor Michael Levitt had to say about excess deaths, where he's been focusing his attention. And Stuart Robinson picks it up similarly. And Peter, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts here. He says, why are we not seeing COVID-19 fatality projections compared with conventional fatalities? I guess what you were talking to a moment ago, Ray, e.g. AIDS, TB, and other virus pandemics. Why not indeed, Peter?
It's a good question. And I mean, what a lot of the excess death arguments actually is sitting in the media as opposed to from scientists. So Levitt obviously has addressed it, but the Financial Times has this dashboard showing how excess deaths are crazy, with an implication that it's all COVID. And I mean, this is a question we've been fielding a lot, and there's some of it will definitely be COVID. There's no doubt about it, but all of it is insane to suggest that. So this is very interesting. So maybe to add to Ray's points is that the West, let's call it the West, let's call it Western Europe and Canada and Australia and whatnot. They reacted different. They reacted to COVID in a way that kind of makes sense, is that they don't really deal with a disease burden of communicable diseases. Generally, flu is kind of the worst thing that happens to them in terms of communicable diseases. So COVID will be the biggest thing that happens to them this year and this decade, because it's a novel virus that does kill, not in numbers that they were expecting, but it definitely kills. Whereas in South Africa and Africa and the developing world, 1/3 of our deaths are communicable diseases. A full third. We only have 55% of our deaths are your kind of traditional heart cancers, things like that. And the remainder would be your accidental deaths. So we already are dealing with a massive disease burden. And COVID on top might increase that that communicable disease burden by 10%. But we're not going from nothing to 10. We're going from a lot to a little bit more than a lot. Now, the problem is that, like I said earlier, the resource allocation problem is going to land up costing the country, irrespective of the jobs that we also are worried about, is that we are allocating resources to attack a 10% problem away from other problems that we're already dealing with, like TB, for example. So TB diagnoses have fallen away by a full 50% since lockdown started. Our hospitals, and this is another misconception I think we should address, is that we're not sitting on a normal day of a normal week in a normal year with state-run hospitals being empty. That's just simply not true. Those hospitals are consistently at above 100% capacity. So this fear of we're going to run out of capacity, yeah, we run out. That is just the way we operate. And currently, and this is kind of week-old data, so as COVID grows, it's changing quite quickly. But a week ago, we were sitting at a fraction of full capacity in state hospitals. Now, some of that is, yes, there's fewer road deaths taking up beds, but a lot of that is not. So where are the people that would traditionally be getting, call them elective surgeries, but treatment for heart and TB and HIV? They're not there, and they haven't vanished. So we're allocating resources on the back of this curve that looks insane in a projection from a real problem we deal with every single day of every week. And those deaths are going to come into our excess deaths, either today or tomorrow or 6 months from now. But that's going to be severe. We are really going to land up with more deaths than we had to, irrespective of the poverty-induced ones that we modeled and Ray spoke about now.
Philip Berger says, in projecting the curve, what variables apart from actual incidences are used? Various people have used different projections, some not so negative.
Yeah, can I take that one, Alec?
Please.
The one variable that's used, which we think is the one that has been systematically misassessed, is what's called the attack rate, or what that translates into in layman's terms. It's, when the disease begins to peter out, how many people will have had it in a population? And the attack rates being used by these modelers are, in our opinion, very, very high in relation to what was suggested by that Diamond Princess model and what has subsequently been suggested by these randomized serology tests that go to try and see what percentage of people have antibodies that reflect that they've had the virus at some point. Okay. And we think that the attack rates being used are too high. So they assume that the virus is just going to go and run off until it's basically infected almost everybody or half the population or some huge number like that. And then from that infected base, they extrapolate a death burden. We think that that is now getting seriously past its expiry date, that kind of approach. It was probably seriously past its expiry date 2 months ago, but let's cut them some slack. Not everybody sees the world the same way. But it seems to be very clear that for some big portion of any population anywhere in the world, this disease just presents very little challenge. And there's strong clinical basis for saying that that might be the case. I mean, we all get exposed to viruses all the time. We don't all end up generating antibodies with respect to them. And the explanation for that is very interesting. Your immune system has a couple of layers to it. They're layers of defense. And there's a part of the immune system called the cellular immune system, which is involved in it's very much sort of a first line of defense story. Your T cells have a certain repertoire in this language of the clinicians, a repertoire for defeating various viruses that may come its way. And over your life, that repertoire gradually decays, and then in a process called immunosenescence. But if you've got a young and healthy kind of immune system, then the virus presenting itself to a cell, it can be dealt with at the cellular level, and in a way that doesn't really ever result in the body producing or manifesting high viral count, or triggering the whole secondary immune system, the humoral immune system, which produces antibodies. So you may get a very modest infection that your body deals with, never test positive on a virology test or on a serology test, and carry on your daily business, knowing no better, not knowing at all that you had actually been exposed to and briefly infected by coronavirus. And if this is the case for a big portion of the population, then you need look no further for an explanation as to why these curves are capping out, much to the surprise of the epidemiologists. And so that's the key parameter, that attack rate that's gone wrong, and it's time to correct it. It's time to see what happens in their models if they assume a lower one.
Tim Elliott builds on that, I guess. He says, an inconvenient truth. In many poor communities across South Africa, lockdown is simply not being followed. Is that factored into our government's thinking? Is that factored into PANDA's thinking, Peter?
I can't speak for what government thinks, so I'll leave that one alone. But this is an interesting one. We were actually having a quick discussion on it this morning, is that once this virus takes hold, emerging evidence from around the world says lockdown or no lockdown makes absolutely no difference. So sure, if you are a small island nation and you just ban travel, you're not going to get anything. So that would be some form of lockdown that's effective. But once it takes hold, there's nothing to stop it, which kind of suggests the counter to what we're talking about, the smart lockdown strategy of locking down harder when cases are heavier. The logic is the wrong way around. When cases get heavier, lockdown doesn't help anymore. So actually, Western Cape should be on level 1 because we've got it. We're on this curve. We're riding the wave. Versus picking a province out of thin air. Mpumalanga might have only 10 cases. So ban travel to Mpumalanga. Like, don't let Western Cape people go there, and lockdown harder. In the argument that lockdown makes sense, which I don't buy in the first place. But if you wanted to lock down, the logic would suggest where it's already taken hold, there's no more point in doing it.
Isn't that what
versus
China
where it hasn't?
Didn't China do that with Wuhan?
Ooh, okay. China's an interesting one because if we could lock down like they did, yes, essentially lock you in your building and deliver you your food. We simply cannot do that. So there's no ways that we can pull that off logistically. The other thing, and I mean, you obviously have listened to Shabir Mehdi, I think, Professor. He's got some interesting takes on another strategy for lockdown, is that the test and trace strategy is essential. So essentially, you need to be able to find 80% of a positive case's contacts so that you can test them and isolate and test and isolate for you to have an effective way of stopping the spread. Now that requires two things: A, getting a test back pretty quickly, and B, having the logistical ability to go and track these people down. We failed dismally on the first one, with the average time of getting a test back sitting at 5 to 15 days. That essentially means that someone has been spreading the virus for at least 10 days. There's no ways you're going to track down 80% of those contacts. The Western Cape, I think Alan Windy was saying, is sitting at 11,000 backlog tests. 11,000. We cannot simply test and trace our way out of this thing. It's just a non-starter. And the World Health Organization changed the goalposts last week, where they said, well, you can only get out of lockdown if you can test and trace. So according to them, we're never getting out of lockdown. It's just kind of this level of insane thinking is not helpful.
Ray, the problem here is that every test costs 1,000 Rand as well, just to add to our tax burden. But are you agreeing with the arguments that are being put forward here, or is there any different way? And I refer specifically to the fact that in the suburbs, lockdown is being heavily implemented and policed, whereas in rural areas and in many parts of the country, Gigi Alcott wrote about, there is no lockdown in the Khasis, in the locations, as he calls it. It's now at level 1. Everybody's just going about their business as per normal.
Yeah, Alec, I mean, if there are only 2 people on Earth and one of them had CV19 and the one didn't, and we knew it had a shelf life of 3 weeks, you could lock the 2 people away for 3 weeks and bring them out, and the lockdown would have worked. But it's not happening like that, because there are 8 billion of us on Earth, and everyone's lives in different circumstances. The lockdowns are done in different ways, in different extents. They start at different times. They're put in different speeds, and everyone's going out to buy food. They're going on public transport. And you see the video footage from India, and there's a complexity of asymptomatic carriers. So we don't know who's had it. I mean, there's a homeless shelter that they tested in Boston, because everyone's on this testing mission, which also is fraught with issues. If you've done any statistics in life, You need to know why you're testing, what are you testing for, how are you testing, etc. But they tested a homeless shelter in Boston, America. There were 400 residents, and they found that 150 of them tested positive. And there wasn't a splutter amongst them, not one cough amongst them. They're all 100%. So, you know, you get Chinese people maybe slightly more tech savvy, maybe definitely more obedient. Some countries may be easier, like New Zealand, Seychelles, Singapore, the islands. You can close them down, but they still have to open up. I mean, Seychelles got 70% of its tourist resident revenue from tourism. It's been closed. So what happens when you take the fence down and the first airplane arrives? You know, you've got slums in India, you've got shacks in South Africa. They're impossible to enforce this lockdown in. And they're countries like in Taiwan, for example. Taiwan, they've been quite mild on lockdown. Taiwan's 20 million people, and they've had 7 deaths from 20 million people. You've got Hong Kong, it's got 8 million people, they've had 4 deaths. And the lockdown's been it's been tiny. Sweden, you've got Sweden versus Denmark. We've seen that debate. Everyone says Sweden's got more deaths than Denmark, but that's not true, because it's like having radio contact with 2 golfers on the golf course, and you ask them, sorry, how many shots have you played? And the one person says, I've had 60 shots. The other one says, I've played 40. And you say, well, the guy who played 40 is playing better golf, but you didn't ask them what hole they were on. They're in different holes. Sweden's on a different hole to Denmark. Swedes can see the clubhouse. They're almost there. The Danish people are still across the river. They're looking in the river. The crocodiles are there. They're going to have to jump in there.
Surely the lockdown substantially reduces the impact on hospital resources and avoids deaths from the subsequent shortages. And certainly from the healthcare professionals that I've spoken to, they were very supportive of the lockdown in the early stages. They said they weren't ready. They were concerned that because they didn't have protective equipment, that they would be having the same kind of mortality rates as we saw in Italy. If you exposed to this virus continuously, lots of people die. Is that not and that was David Scott's point, is that not a fair point to raise, Nick?
I think there was an argument to me made along those lines for a short lockdown to increase resourcing. But there's been a broad failure here of risk management principles, basic risk management principles. If you speak to the doctors, they will tell you that version of the story. And I might add, not all of them. There have been substantial numbers of doctors who've come out saying, no, listen, this is a humanitarian crisis underway. This lockdown must end, and we must deal with what's coming to us. You know, so it's not a universally held perspective amongst doctors and the medical profession. But you've got to understand they're looking at it through their prism. If you're a small, informal business owner, your perspective is very different. You're watching your children get thinner and thinner every day, and the food parcel's not arriving. And your perspective is that the risk is being overwhelmingly slanted in a direction that hurts you unfairly. You know, there has been a failure here, and Peter sort of alluded to it. You know, what are we going to do with childhood incidents of diarrhea? That takes out 10,000 kids or something like that. I forget the precise numbers every year in South Africa. And that's closely related to living conditions and poverty and sanitation and hygiene, which is going to go downhill sharply. We've done it already. That, unfortunately, is a reality. We are going to have major backward steps in all of those regards, okay? So you have these people who want to get the 10 zillionth ventilator ordered before we unlock, you know, and I look at that and I scratch my head and I say, that is insane. We have lost our minds. The risk management philosophy is being taken at too low a level, or with regard only towards one element of a very broad and complex equation. And we have to correct that now. Our numbers, the numbers that Peter was talking about, are not like theoretical. You know, that turns into real stuff pretty fast, one way or another. You know, by 100,000 mechanisms, the horror of lockdown is visited upon the people. And we've got to stop sitting there with the microscope on this one story and ignoring the much broader canvas of our society. I think that this is going to grow quickly. I don't think our voices will change the general mood by more than a few days, because when the reality hits home to your average person who's sitting without a job, without the ability to put food on the family food on the table for his family, when that person looks around and realizes that he doesn't know anybody who's died of coronavirus, but almost everybody he knows has starving and malnourished children, I think the reaction is going to change very quickly. And I think it could be quite extreme.
Just before we close off, because we've had our full hour already, and I'd like each of you to give us maybe 2 or 3 minutes in summary. The question from Louis Rousseau, and I do apologize, there were many questions we couldn't get to, but he says, Nick, Peter, I believe actuaries have criticized your approach. How do you respond to those criticisms?
That's a good question. So we've had, to be honest, the overwhelming majority of the actuaries have been supportive. So there were a couple of things. One is that we never presented that we are representing the view of the profession. I think it's like expecting one lawyer to say that he's representing the entire legal fraternity when he talks. So the society did have to clarify that, although we never claimed that. So interestingly, we've invited comments and criticism, and we've addressed most of it in due course, bearing in mind we also doing the best we can with stretched resources ourselves. Probably the most interesting, let's call it a peer review we got, came out of the Tropical School of Medicine of the London School of Economics, which is a very prestigious institution. And they had some quite I wouldn't call them aggressive, but strong critiques. And we spent a lot of time working through with them, and now they are 100% on our page, taking into account the South African context. The actuarial work, the criticizing has been along essentially two avenues. The one is that we're implying there's a causality between poverty and mortality, and in which case it might just be correlation. I mean, you can just think about that one. I'm not going to address it, but we have now got plenty of resources that says, yeah, it's quite obvious that poverty is causal in that relationship. The second one was about the 2008 global financial crisis didn't see a massive spike in mortality, so why would we see it here? And we have actually addressed that in the feedback and on our latest reports, is that that's apples and oranges. You can actually look at the response to pandemics and what happens in the response to that thing, as opposed to the pandemic itself, looking at things like Ebola and the impact it had. And the severity of this economic lockdown is going to be significantly worse than global financial crisis. So those are the two main ones, and a bit of bickering on assumptions, but that's par for the course. We've run multiple assumptions now, and we kind of get to the same answer. There was a question that we're using New York data, which is also just a misunderstanding. We were using New York as a proxy for the spread of deaths by age, and now we have actually started using South African data now that we have a couple hundred deaths. So nothing that actually breaks our conclusion, to be honest. But we welcome it. We've got a website, and we respond to all the emails. So anyone, the more we can have this conversation transparently and openly and address these kind of questions, the closer we'll get to a consensus answer. So the model will be wrong. I guarantee you that models are wrong. And the more we get difficult questions on it, the better we will get at the model itself and the paper itself. And hopefully the more people we can convince.
I'm looking forward to your closing arguments, as it were, but just to share this from Anthony Jackson, he says, I work at Chris Barnard Hospital in Cape Town, 180 beds, half full, 10 COVID cases, 5 in ICU and 1 on a ventilator. The lockdown must end. I agree with your excellent panelists. Ray, do you want to do your summary first?
Yeah, thanks, Alec. I think basically, if you want to, we're trying to stop people from dying. The only way to really stop dying is to stop births. So if we lock down on births, there'll be no babies, and in 100 years, there'll be no deaths. And that's obviously ridiculous. That's the extreme version. Lockdown doesn't work. It's not going to fix the virus. That's been proven. It wasn't intended to stop deaths. It's cost millions, well, probably thousands of times the cost of life of people compared to what it might have saved, which is probably none. The society knows what to do. People know what to do. Governments are telling them to stay at home, forcing them to stay at home. They're actually, therefore, forcing them to earn nothing and forcing them to starve. Governments are telling people to starve, instructing them. I think that's That's just unacceptable. I think it's time to change the narrative now. I think there's enough fear. There's been too much fear out there. I think the fear is going to haunt society for a long time. And everybody, all the leaders, the governments must try and take another narrative, which is one of hope, to paint the picture on the other side of the river. Let's describe this. Let's get it over with. Every day is costing lives here, and we just need to make, just like we made a very hasty decision on the way in based on fear, we need to make a very hasty decision on the way out based on courage. So we need to stop the lockdown and paint pictures of hope and move forward.
Nick, I'm going to ask in your closing statement if you could please address this question from Philip Copeman, who says, can you please ask the panelists to summarize what we should do? What should our policy be? I understand that it can't change next week, but what should we be doing?
Well, we should definitely be ending lockdown. The disease is smaller than we thought it was by a significant amount, 1/40th or something, what we originally thought. The effect of lockdown, the beneficial effect, is, it appears, negligible to zero. The economic consequences are much bigger than anybody had anticipated, because mainly we've gone through a much longer duration lockdown than everybody had in mind when it was started. So the case now is like completely clear. We must end the lockdown. That's number one. Okay. There are steps, I think, that have low economic cost that could be contemplated around maybe just controlling large crowded events for a little while, maybe looking at mask using, and then just appeals to people's common sense to do sensible things. I think that's one of the very sad features here, is that the assumption has been made that the man in the street is an idiot, and he's not. I'm actually concerned about the opposite, that there's so much fear that people will be reluctant to send their kids to school or to go back to the workplace, to frequent restaurants and shebeens and so on again. I think that could be a very difficult problem that we find ourselves having to grapple with quite soon. Beyond that, I think there are a couple of clever ideas that have been doing the rounds around how we can help indigent old people who might want to avail themselves of some kind of protection from the disease, which is a sentiment which we completely understand. And there we don't have to look too far. Increasing the state old age pension for a few months so that they can afford to put in place childcare where they're looking after children and so on. There are a number of ideas like this which are worth playing with, and we are going to address our attention at PANDA to coming up with a suite of such ideas. That's definitely on the cards for us. But yes, the immediate thing, the thing that has to be done to avert an enormous humanitarian crisis, is to end lockdown now. Not stage 3, not stage 2, not another elaborate labyrinth of cockamamie rules and pies and winter clothes and cigarettes and all of this nonsense. We have to end the story now.
Hudson, thank you. Peter Castleden, your closing comments?
Okay, thanks. I think I would also like to add to that our resources should be dedicated to where they will have the most impact, and that I have enormous amounts of empathy for the healthcare workers. I think yesterday there was the 5th death in Tygerberg Hospital of a frontline healthcare worker from COVID, which is just, none of us are being expected to go to work every day and face this high viral load. So I have a huge amount of empathy, and we should do everything we can to give the right levels of protection to those people. I think that's without a doubt, because it must be really tough. The second thing is we know who the susceptible populations are by now. So we should be dedicating resources, like Nick said, to trying to help the older comorbid people to isolate themselves by choice. Again, I agree. Let's not treat people like idiots. Let's give them the right information so they can make the right decisions for themselves personally. I think we're also missing a trick on the HIV front, because we know how effective ARVs are to build immune systems. The government should have, from day one, gone on an extra drive to raise awareness, get your HIV tested, get on treatment, because that is going to have a net positive effect. The treatment is widely available and free, and it's a tablet a day these days. And it will save lives. And the fact that I'm not sure we've made a dent in that is a real pity, but still not too late. But overall, this is a tragic situation. We do have to cross this river, like Ray says, but we just need to do it as safely as possible, given what we know and the resources we have.
We will be publishing a copy of this webinar. I'm going to ask the three of you to commit to something else, though. We have many questions. We'd like to publish all of them and maybe responses to them. If you feel inclined to do so, I'd like to send the questions to all of you and give it a crack. It's going to take you a while, but I think as a public service, it would be most appreciated. Happy to do that. Just to close off with John Taylor, who says he's from the End Lockdown Now Coalition, says, and I'm going to read his comment, the only way out is for our government to embrace a face-saving way out of the fort that they're hiding inside. We believe that there needs to be a new Hearts and Minds campaign to counter the current propaganda. All political leaders, the president, and all senior tiers of government need to implement our Save the Children, Save the Nation campaign. It involves all of them going to as many creches, playgroups, preschools, primary schools, etc., without masks and hugging, greeting, playing with the children. Virtually no children contract or die from COVID, nor are they carriers. And it reminds me of a piece that is in the process of being published on Biznews from Peter Eusti of the Free Market Foundation, who says he's one of the very high-risk people, so I presume over 80, and he says that you've got to end it now for the sake of the future generations, because what they're inheriting by protecting people like him is going to really not be worth it, and he doesn't want his protection to be causing a destructive situation for his grandchildren. An interesting conversation today. Thanks very much, gents, for sharing your minds and wisdom and research on a subject that is going to occupy us for quite a few months into the future. We look forward to picking up with you again, and more strength to the contributions that you're making to society. Thank you. Stu, when are we likely to have the recording available?
Thanks, Alec. It should take an hour or two to process, and I've put a link to the Biznews YouTube channel, Alec, and I'll put it up there as soon as possible. But I'd say in the next couple of hours.
Brilliant. Thanks again. I'm Alec Hogg, not Stu, and till the next time, cheerio.